There is a unique bond between our countries.
We have, I would say, probably the best relationships right now with Israel that we ever had.
There has been no greater bond than that.
This bond between the United States and Israel seems to be unbreakable. But can the US be both a close ally to Israel and an honest broker in negotiations with the Palestinians? After more than 25 years, US broker talks have failed to produce a lasting deal between Israel and the Palestinians. None of the key issues laid out in the 1993 Oslo Accords have been resolved. At least, no result on paper, but the story on the ground is different. Illegal Israeli settlements, for example, have continued to grow during the peace process. In 1993, there were more than 250,000 settlers living in the occupied territories. As of 2017, there are over 650,000. Borders are another example. The current boundaries between Israel and the occupied territories are supposed to be temporary arrangements, but Israel has militarized these lines. So while there's no border deal, there's a concrete wall, military checkpoints, and a complicated system of residency and travel permits for Palestinians. Here's one more example: the final status of Jerusalem. Oslo laid out a basic framework for a two-state solution with Jerusalem as a shared capital. But 2 years later, the US ended up supporting Israel's claim to the city, although Washington avoided doing anything about it for security reasons. That all changed in 2017 when Donald Trump turned loose promises into reality. Despite the failure to get a deal, the US is still the main international broker in the peace process. But how did the US get this role in the first place?
The peace process was born out of an American victory, both in the Cold War and in the Gulf War. Having come out victorious, the United States decided that it wanted to remake the Middle East, a sort of a new Pax Americana, where at the heart of it there is a cross-regional peace process between the Israelis on the one side and the Palestinians and the Arabs on the other side.
The Oslo Accords were at the heart of this process. Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization signed the accords in 1993, overseen by US President Bill Clinton. Up until then, Palestinians had little or no representation of their own. Oslo called for the creation of the Palestinian Authority and the gradual withdrawal of Israeli forces from parts of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The idea was that after the PA was established, more talks would be held about borders, Israeli settlements, the status of Jerusalem, and Palestinian refugees. The PLO recognized the State of Israel. Israel recognized the PLO as a representative of the Palestinian people. But some say the framing of that mutual recognition is problematic.
In this peace process, Israel was recognized by the Palestinians as a state over 78% of historic Palestine, while the Israelis were not asked to recognize Palestine or even the prospect of a Palestinian state. So this dissymmetry in the framing of the peace process was the initial sin that led to more and more Israeli intransigence and more Palestinian weakness throughout quarter of a century of a peace process.
While talks went back and forth, things on the streets were getting worse. The Israeli Prime Minister who signed on to Oslo, Yitzhak Rabin, was assassinated by an ultra-nationalist Israeli in 1995. By 2000, the Second Intifada broke out in the occupied territories. Right-wing parties and policies began to dominate Israeli politics. Meanwhile, the US sponsored over half a dozen talks and summits to revive the peace process over the years. They all ended in failure. Outside the peace process, the US has been a steadfast ally of Israel. The US repeatedly uses its veto powers at the UN to block resolutions critical of its ally. And despite a few disagreements between the two, US aid to Israel never stopped. The United States has donated $134.7 billion to Israel in aid since 1946, with the majority of that going to the military. During the Obama administration, the US pledged $38 billion in military aid to Israel between 2019 and 2028. The US role of a Middle East peace broker is taking on a whole new script with Donald Trump.
To move the
Since
American
2016,
embassy
not only
from
has the
Tel
US
Aviv
formally and fully recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, it also froze all assistance to the UN Refugee Agency UNRWA and closed the PLO representative office in Washington, D.C. Some see these steps as a way to cement the status quo.
The Trump administration insists that Palestinians have to accept the realities of the ground, realities that the United States helped Israel create on the ground in the occupied territories. And they basically mean that the Palestinians will have to accept Israel's control over Jerusalem, that they would have to accept Israeli settlements in their own homeland, and they would have to accept Israeli control over all of historic Palestine from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. And they also have to accept that there is no solution to the refugee question that involves any return to their original homeland.
Trump has also announced the so-called deal of the century and put his son-in-law and senior advisor Jared Kushner in charge. Kushner and his team have kept the initiative secret, but the details of the deal might not matter much. It's already been rejected by most Palestinians, and it is unclear who, if anyone, will represent them at any final negotiations. Their political leadership is divided, their economy is deteriorating, and they have no other broker to turn to.